Welcome. So in the last reading of this book, we found that Comet went from a small pond and found himself in a much larger lake. And now, what happens once he's in this much larger lake? Whoa, looks like he meets someone. So one day, let me just make sure you can see this. One day, Comet noticed a large, bright green bird sitting in a tree looking at him. And here is a zoomed up view. Here's Comet. Comet's looking up, and here is this big green bird sitting on a branch. Now Comet says, "What are you looking at, bird? You are not going to eat me today," stated Comet with confidence. And so now that bird says, "I'm not looking to eat you, I promise. I'm wondering why you look so pretty compared to the other fish in this pond," said the bird. And then Comet says, "I know I'm pretty, but I also know that makes me look tasty to birds like yourself." And then the bird says, "I promise I won't eat you now that we are getting to know each other. We can become good friends." That's kind of interesting. Does a predator find the prey it wants to eat attractive? Maybe, I don't know. That's an interesting thought there. And then this makes sense. Like if you become good friends, you will have lower likelihood of wanting to eat your friend. Okay. Now the science part of it, I wanted to explore bird intelligence. When I was growing up, there was an insult. People would say, "You have a bird brain," and that was supposed to mean you're stupid. And for a while, people did think that birds are stupid. One reason why is that if you look at the brain of a bird, it's quite small compared to a human brain, or to other creatures out there. The other reason why people thought birds were stupid is if you look at the zoomed up version of their brain, this is a songbird brain versus a human brain, look how smooth it is. So the top of our brain is called the cortex. It has all of these little wrinkles in it, and this is where people think a lot of our higher level problem solving, consciousness, things like that reside. And creatures who have very smooth brains are ones where people tend to think that they're not as capable of multi-step problem solving or kind of stupid stuff like that. But it turns out that in birds, that's not the case. Despite the fact that their brains are small and smooth, they are remarkably intelligent, especially parrots and corvids, such as crows, who can learn to use tools. They can solve complex multi-step problems that require innovation. They can do delayed gratification. They can count, and they can recognize themselves in a mirror. In some cognitive tests, parrots like the African gray can outperform a chimpanzee, even a 4 or 5-year-old child. In certain tasks, they can outperform them. Now that's kind of remarkable because the brain of a parrot may only be 5 to 20 grams. The chimpanzee brain is 10 times heavier. It's 400 grams. So how can such a small brain outperform a chimpanzee? So one of the big surprises was that when they went into a bird brain, they found that it's actually in some ways very different than a mammal brain. So first of all, the density of a bird's brain is a lot more dense than that of a chimpanzee or even a human. So if you took a little cube of brain from a bird, you'll have way more neurons than a little cube of brain from a human. So that's surprising. So that's one reason why they're so intelligent despite a small brain. But it also turns out the architecture of their brain is a bit different than mammal brains. So mammal brains will have these layers on them, but the bird brains, from what I understand, have nuclei. So they have these clusters of neurons that are connected. So it's very interesting. It's interesting to look at organisms who have brain architecture that's different than our own, and it gives them advantages for certain types of things. Okay. I should say last statement is despite these differences, there are similarities in what birds pallium, I don't know how to pronounce that, and how it's similar to the human neocortex. Okay, awesome. So now coming to the subconscious part of the book. So the last few subconscious is really this, just to give you a sense of what I've been talking about in these subconscious parts. The first part was, how do ideas go from the subconscious into the conscious mind? I talked about how the landscape of your subconscious can influence your interpretation of reality itself. In the other illustrations also talked about how some of these ideas that come from the subconscious can be distracting and can be frustratingly distracting. And then I talked and explored the idea that if you can harness this distraction, sometimes it can become a really unique engine for creativity. But if you can't harness it, then of course it can be pretty damaging and negative towards accomplishing tasks and things like that. Now in this illustration, I dive a little bit deeper into the layers of consciousness. I talk a little bit about thoughts through this internal dialogue, but I talk about the layers of consciousness, subconsciousness, things like that. And it's this image that I drew is motivated from these philosophical discussions I was having with my mother, and she shared a famous ancient philosophical parable from the Upanishads. So the idea I'm going to share with you was written like 700 to 500 BCE. That's a long time ago. It's mind-blowing to me that thousands and thousands of years ago, people were having some of the deepest discussions and thoughts around the layers of our consciousness. Sometimes people think that humans were very simple then, but this is contrary to that. We were having really profoundly deep conversations around what is consciousness and who are we. So the parable is pretty simple. My mom translated it from the Sanskrit, so this is her translation. Two birds with beautiful wings are inseparable. They are sitting on the same tree, clinging to each other. One of them eats the fruit from the tree, and the other one does not eat, but watches only. So the interpretation here is that these two birds are inseparable, so they're part of the same identity. And one interpretation could be that these are different aspects of ourselves, of our conscious minds. One part of our conscious mind, the bird who's eating, is consumed by being in the present, the world, right? You eat a sweet fruit, you feel good. You eat a bitter fruit, you feel sad. And because you're so woven into the structure of this world, often the world is uncontrollable. You can't control what's happening in the world. And so you can get thrown into cycles of sadness, of sorrow. Now, the other bird who's non-judgmentally watching, this bird you could say is our divine self, or our larger self, or our collective consciousness, or even an expression of God. And this bird has the capability of looking at the truth, looking beyond the illusions, right? And within this philosophical structure, the idea is that what our local day-to-day self is seeing is Maya, is illusion. And Maya isn't false necessarily. That illusion isn't necessarily false, but it does distract us from seeing the full truth. And in a way, neuroscience agrees with this. Where all the truth that's coming into us gets shattered across layers of our brain and then gets stitched back together somewhere. And we're not seeing a full representation of reality. Instead, we're seeing an interpretation of what is important for us. And so this is not inherently all that wrong. So one example of this is death. So when our day-to-day self sees someone who we love die, it's perfectly okay and good to feel sad about it. But what some of this philosophy teaches is that if you step back to the divine self and you see the truth is that we're all interconnected. We're all expressions of the same energy, the same divinity. There's no such thing as actual death. There's only transformation of energy from one form to another. So that person who died just transformed into, divinity itself, into energy. So those are examples of what they mean by that. Now, for people who do deep meditation, there's this term called Zakshi. And Zakshi is that you do meditation and you can connect to this larger, self of your representation of yourself. And once you're in there and you experience Zakshi, you can then, as a third person, as a global representation of yourself, look bird's eye view down on your life. And sometimes you can detach from the negative things that are happening. And by doing so, you can eventually emanate a universal feeling of love around you. So that's part of what the mythology or not, or maybe the philosophy of Sakshi is saying. And so, even mindfulness meditation talks about this non-judgmental observation of what your thoughts and what you're doing, and eventually being able to not be stuck here, come up here and be able to manifest that universal feeling of love. So in the diagram itself, we have this double layered membrane. Everything below it is the conscious world. This fish is a representation of the conscious attentive mind, and it's talking with this bird. And this bird, I always have this internal dialogue, non-stop talking. And that's what this is representing over here. Sometimes I get very frustrated by it because I'm trying to reach this state over here. And so there's this dialogue happening, and the bird is sitting on this branch, which I drew in a way where it's hard to interpret, right? Is it part of the conscious or subconscious world? Or in a way, it belongs to both, right? The internal dialogue is a conscious dialogue, but sometimes it's motivated by things in your subconscious. So this belongs to both worlds. And then the Sakshi itself, this larger bird, is part of that subconscious entity that you can reach sometimes when you're meditating. And it has a third eye. A lot of the mythology of the third eye I don't like, but the parts of it that I do like is that it's a divine vision. And when it opens, you can see truth and beauty that otherwise you may take for granted or not be able to see. And so that's what this image over here is describing.